Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Right in Front of My Face, the podcast that talks about big things happening right in front of us. I am your host, Shannon Hull, and I am very excited to introduce you to my next guest. Vanessa Sturgeon is a CEO. She's a wife and a mom of 3 boys living in Portland. Her family is white, upper class, but still a bit non-traditional as they adopted their youngest son, Jackson, from the Congo when he was 3. Vanessa reached out to me right when my podcast started last November and asked if she could come on and try to educate parents on how to talk to their kids about race. Despite living in one of the most progressive cities on the West Coast, her family was experiencing racism on a level that even she was surprised by. Her earnest intent back then was to help parents navigate having these difficult conversations with their kids. The conversation that follows was recorded on March 6th. 1 week before our country sheltered in place, and almost 3 months before Black Lives Matter would start a revolution. The conversation is timely, to say the least. We are 2 white women who claim our privilege in this conversation. And my hope in putting this interview out into the world is to share my own hesitation and discomfort in broaching the subject of racism with our children. I've asked myself so many times in the last couple of weeks what I can do to continue supporting Black Lives Matter. And this conversation with Vanessa, where she's so open to educating me, is one of the ways I'm hoping I can contribute through my kids. I'm attempting to lead by example that having very uncomfortable conversations is a really, really good thing. So Vanessa, you and I have known each other for a very long time.
A very, very longer than I care to admit.
I can't believe it, actually, because we still look amazing.
Totally.
I just have a different color hair now.
Right. You do have a different color hair, but you look the same otherwise.
Exactly the same.
Maybe even better.
As when we were 18. I feel like we are aging in reverse. But you had reached out to me after you had heard the podcast and offered to talk about a topic that is really very, very important, I think, because your family chose to adopt a son from Africa, and your experience with that has been really powerful. And you had offered to come in and talk about how to talk about race with our kids.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we don't talk about much just because the Pacific Northwest really isn't as diverse as a lot of other areas of the country, and it doesn't come up as often as it should.
No, it doesn't. And I remember, I just told you this, but I remember when you told me what you wanted to talk about. And my son, Luke, is the exact same age as Jackson. I think they're a month apart. And I hung up the phone with you and I thought, oh my God, I have actually never talked to Luke about what you can, what you can't say, how does he notice that kids' skin color is different? We just never talked about it. So it really resonated with me as a parent. So I am hoping today that you can kind of take us through what your experience was like with adoption, the training that you and your family had to go through, your experience with it. And most importantly to me, the takeaway is help us as parents and the listeners that are parents understand what we need to be talking to our kids about.
Okay, that sounds like a great topic for the day.
There you go. There, see, I went to Catholic school. There's our outline and our thesis statement.
Well done.
It's a 5-paragraph essay. So tell us about you. Do a quick intro.
So I am from Portland. I went to Jesuit with you.
Yep.
And then we roomed together at Santa Clara. So lots of Catholic school in my background here. And then I went on to graduate school and have been since in a family business, running that business since I was in my early 20s. So at this point, I've been doing it for almost 20 years.
I mean, I want to say that I knew you when you worked at Abercrombie and Fitch, so.
True. Very true. And actually right around that time is when Abercrombie got in trouble for writing racially motivated notes on people's applications.
Really?
They did. They got in trouble for saying cute Asian, skinny Asian, that kind of stuff on people's applications. And they got in actually really big trouble for it.
Wow. Okay. So you move back to Portland, you get married, you start your own family. You've got 2 boys of your own.
Yep.
And then you and your husband decide to adopt a third. So tell me about that decision.
So it's really part of Tony's family's culture that they're deeply ingrained in the children's services field.
Okay.
Tony's my husband. His mother ran a visitation center for children who'd been separated from their parents by the courts, where the parents could visit their kids in a supervised fashion while they were, training and learning how to be better parents and potentially getting reunited with them. His aunt ran children's services in Klamath County for years. His cousins are attorneys in the AG's office that do child termination hearings. And he has a brother who's adopted, who's African-American, Native American, and he is 21 now. It's part of his family's culture. Actually, his brother, my brother-in-law, also has 2 foster children. So we've had so many positive experiences with adoption that we decided that we had some more capacity in our lives for more kids. So,
did you get any flack for that decision from people?
None.
Okay.
I mean, my mom was a little concerned. Of course, you never really know what you're getting when you get an adopted child. They've been through a lot of trauma, and we were not interested in adopting an infant.
Right.
We wanted a child that was a little older that probably wouldn't otherwise get adopted.
Tell me about that process, because really I don't know much about it. So I would love the education, but where do you even start?
Well, you find an agency and do research into the agencies, because that makes all the difference. Some agencies are really engaged and really manage the orphanages that are across the world, and manage them well, because it takes active management.
Right.
You have to remember that the employees of these orphanages are living in abject poverty. So the kids in the orphanage are eating better than their families are. So food often walks out the door that's meant for the orphans with the staff.
Interesting.
So the way that it works in Congo is that the children are placed in government orphanages. And then once they get matched with a family, they move into a different orphanage that's sponsored by either, an American agency or an Italian or a French agency. And in the government-run orphanages, there's no protection from the outside world. So the doors are open. The kids run in and out of the streets. They're eating twice a week on average.
Wow.
And by the time they get transferred into an orphanage that's sanctioned by a different country, different agencies, they're eating once a day at least. So it's quite a step up, and you're paying for, during those months while you're waiting for the adoption to go through, you're paying for medical insurance and some subsidy on food.
Wow. So
the kids are getting treated. Like in the government-run orphanages, if a kid gets malaria, the $36 that it costs for the treatment medication is out of reach. And so the kids just die.
It is such a stark culture contrast. So tell me about where you started. So you found an agency. Then what happens? Because I would think that as this information slowly comes across to you and you realize what's actually happening over there, that all you want to do is get on a plane and go rescue a kid.
Totally. Here's the thing. In Congo, 15% of the kids under 18 are orphaned. So
15%.
Yeah, it's over 1 million kids. So there are so many kids that you can't help.
Right.
It's really, really sad. And, you can't help everyone. You do your best. And these agencies do a really nice job of taking care of the kids. The orphanages are a lot different. There's high cement walls around all of them. The kids are not running in and out. So most of the people that are involved in the adoption community come through the hardcore faith-based organizations. Sure. So we were outliers in that way because we're not faith-based people. Not that we're judging that piece of it. It's just that there's very different focuses. We were more focused on preparing our family through counseling. So there are counselors out there that are adoption-based counselors that walk you through what to expect when you've had a kid come through that's through the orphanage system and they're food starved.
Right. And so that was going to be one of my questions, but I just want to back up for 1 second. So you find your agency that you're comfortable with. Are they faith-based or no?
They are definitely, but not intensely so.
Okay. So how do you pick Congo?
So a lot of countries in Africa require that you live there for extended periods of time.
So in the research that I had done, this was going to be a question of mine. I have heard a bunch of stories where you have to do a homestay in the country.
Well, Congo doesn't require it. Like we weren't going to leave our other two boys here for an extended period to go live in Africa. And we're not talking a month. We're talking about multiple long stints in Africa.
There are long stays in Africa for a lot of the adoptions.
Yes. And our adoption counselor was really clear with us that it is not a good idea to go back and forth and visit your child in the orphanage, because you never know in Africa if an adoption is going to come to fruition. There are a lot of things in the government that are very unpredictable. So creating another broken bond for a child does a lot of damage.
For sure. And for your own kids too, I would guess.
Sure.
So you live in an area of Portland that is predominantly white, affluent. How do you really try to prep your family for bringing an African child who's going to have some different needs into your home?
Well, the first thing you talk through is the medical side, because that is bound to be part of,
for sure,
of the process. And then talking about race. Okay, first rule of adoption, don't disrupt the birth order. So it makes your bio kids feel displaced, and it can have disastrous consequences. So when choosing to adopt, you want to make sure that you're not disrupting that birth order.
Interesting.
Number one piece of advice from the counselor. The second piece of advice about race is do not shy away from the conversations. Point out actively people that are brown in the community, and make sure you're fostering connections with other people that are in positions of authority, police officers, firemen, dentists, anyone of a different race.
Yeah.
So they make sure that they see that there are lots of different things that they can do with their lives.
For sure. That's interesting. How long does this whole process take? What is the prep timeline like?
It took 2.5 years for us to get Jackson over, which is crazy. It was way too long. But you never know what's going to happen. Our government is really predictable in terms of processing. You get fingerprinted, you go to USCIS, you sit in this room with a bunch of nerdy white guys and super hot Ukrainian and Russian women who are doing the they've gotten married.
Yeah.
And it is like,
I've watched 90 Day Fiance, so
yes.
I feel like I'm an expert.
Okay, great. An expert. But it's funny because you hear about it all the time, but then you sit in those USCIS offices and see it unfolding.
Yeah.
Like a sea of khakis and white New Balance shoes with these very, very attractive young Eastern European women. But the adoptees are also in that same process as well. It's very predictable. It takes X number of months. It's outlined very well. Africa is a shit fling in terms of process. You never know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And things can move through the court system very quickly.
Or not.
And we were unwilling to ascribe to the bribe model, which works very well. But it wasn't something that we were willing to encourage. So you can get your application processed a lot more quickly if you bribe the right officials.
It all just seems so sketchy.
It is a little sketchy. I mean, especially when you think about who the end recipients are. these kids who are sitting in orphanages waiting for families. Meanwhile, they're suffering from physical ailments and not building attachments. And, you know, the African orphanages do a fabulous job in that way. They have really lovely, caring, amazing people that work in them and treat these kids really well. So they get a lot of love, just not a lot of nutrition and not a lot of medical care.
So you're waiting 2.5 years. How old are your boys when this process starts?
Well, we've had Jackson for 5 years, so it's 7.5. They were, 3 and 5.
So they're growing up with this notion that they are going to get a younger brother. They just don't know.
And they're seeing pictures of him all the time, and he's looking at pictures of us all the time. We sent over a photo album with his room and pictures of the house and our dogs. And so he's at least familiarizing himself.
As much as he can.
Yeah, as much as he can through pictures. And so they were waiting, and they were so excited when he finally got here and couldn't wait to have this little brother. And then as soon as he runs up to him in the airport, he recognizes them. And he has a really gregarious personality. So the three of them really meshed, and it was an immediate connection.
That must have been unbelievable to see.
It was so cool. They speak 0 words of the same language.
Yeah, well, that was going to be another question I have. I mean, so you waited 2.5 years. You have this huge airport greeting. You have this child now in your house for the first night. Tell me about the difference bringing Jackson home and bringing, a newborn baby home.
Well, we were bringing a 3.5-year-old into the house, right? And he's scared to death of our dogs and our cat and can't get enough food. There's no such thing as enough food.
How much did he weigh when you brought him home?
He weighed 26 pounds. And as soon as he started treatment for giardia and hookworms, that deflated down to 21 pounds because most of that's water weight in the big distended abdomen that a child with early childhood malnutrition has. So we knew that was coming.
Right.
So he was a 21-pound 4-year-old. And
I cannot even imagine.
Oh, he was really skinny, really tiny. None of his vaccinations could be done in his arms. They were too thin. So it all had to happen in his backside. And it took about 6 months and 3 courses of treatment for each of the 2 parasites that he had before his body really started absorbing nutrition. And that second 6 months, he grew 6 inches.
Oh my God, in 6 months?
Yep. Finally, his body was absorbing nutrition. So he would go to the bathroom when he first arrived.
Yeah.
And he had living worms inside of his body. And when you have giardia, your body rejects all fat. So there was a sheen on the toilet water of all the fat that he was intaking. So he really wasn't absorbing much.
I mean, just as a mom, watching your kid go through this process must have been excruciating.
It was, but I was prepared that there was going to be an end to it. And for my bio boys, as they're complaining that their chicken nuggets are overdone and Jackson is eating the stink bugs and the spiders off our walls live.
Because that's all he knew?
That's all he knew. It was food. He could get his hands on it and he would eat whatever you put in front of him. So, wow. And to the point of sickness all the time. And he got over that relatively quickly because we would just leave food out. He could have whatever he wanted at any time. And he figured out pretty quickly that wasn't going to stop for him. So he settled into that pretty quickly. But every time he would take a bite of any food, a dried apple or take a drink of Sprite, he would go, Every time he took a bite.
Just savoring it, like food appreciation like you've never seen. Did your boys recognize that? Because they're still pretty young.
Oh, they totally recognized it. They totally got it. And it fundamentally changed them as people, understanding that there are people in the world that will eat anything you give them because they are just starving.
They don't know where their next meal is going to come from.
Exactly.
I mean, it just is like that whole place of privilege that we do not even understand.
We don't even understand it at all. So he'd been in 5 different orphanages while he'd been in Congo.
At 3.5. I mean, that is so crazy. That is just to think about it.
And then he was so scared every time we'd get in the car, because every time he'd ever been in a car before, he'd been moved. So I would have to physically stuff him in the car. I'm sweating. He's crying, yelling, "No, mama, no," because he's thinking I'm going to leave him somewhere.
And how long does it take him to learn English? Because it is a certain amount of time where you like literally can't communicate with him and say like, I'm not going anywhere, but he would not even understand it.
He wouldn't understand it, and his experience tells him something different, right?
Yeah.
So it took about 6 months for him to really be able to speak English, and about a year before he was really there. So I stuffed him in the car every day for 8 weeks and walked around Whole Foods with him. He sat in the basket, in the front of the basket. My back was killing me because he would wrap his arms around my neck. He was so afraid I was going to leave him. And we would walk around Whole Foods and I'd be hunched over, walking around Whole Foods with his arms around my neck in the shopping cart. And it took about 2 months for him to understand that he was coming home every time with us. And once he got there, he started to really be able to settle in.
That's a long 8 weeks.
Oh, my back was killing me after all that time. And it's funny because with my other 2 boys, no one ever tried to just pick them up at the grocery store or Rite Aid or whatever. And I think that because people know he's not biologically mine,
right?
People felt comfortable picking him up.
That is crazy to me.
It is crazy, and it was weird at first. And then you realize people are just trying to be good. Like they know that this kid needs love.
Mm-hmm.
They can sort of see his story unfolding when they see the 2 of us together, and they want to show him appreciation and love. It's a little weird though when you think that somebody's going to run off with your kid.
Yeah.
But I sort of got used to it and would find nice ways to say, hey, if you could just hand him back to me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That would be great.
He's definitely new to the community.
Yeah.
But we live in a tiny town.
Yeah. So. Were you pretty open with people about what was happening?
Well, it's hard not to be because, it's like trying to hide a giant boob job, right? Like everybody knows.
We all see it. We just can't say anything.
Exactly. So I feel like it's just easier to be out there. Hey, yes, he's adopted.
Yes, you may have noticed.
Yes.
Did you feel like even when you brought him home, there were like intonations of race that you hadn't seen before that you didn't expect?
Well, people were so welcoming to him. They were so kind. And we didn't see much, but every once in a while, a kid would go, "Is he with you?" Yeah, he's with us. He's with us. He's adopted. And then you can see people kind of understanding. And Jackson would love to hear the story of how he was adopted and how he asks us still about once a week, "Why did you pick me?" He just wants to hear why he's so loved and how we're so happy to have him. And he fully understands now that he's part of the family and not going anywhere and feels like one of the brothers now. But he still wants to be constantly reassured that we chose him, we wanted him, we love him. And, it's really pretty sweet, actually. It's the same conversation every time. I stick to the same script, so he hears the same message every time.
That's really cool. I feel like kids love their own origin stories. Like, do your boys love hearing about their birth?
They love hearing about their birth.
It is so funny. Mine have just started really asking like detailed questions about it. So I can't imagine. I mean, I can only imagine how much Jackson would love hearing his story because it is different.
It's totally different. And his memory isn't as good because of the early childhood malnutrition. That's totally one of the side effects. He remembers very little about Africa, even though he was older when he left the country. And most of what has become solid memories to him are things that we've told him.
Right.
But as soon as he saw Tony getting off the plane in Congo to pick him up, he started screaming, "Papa, Papa." He recognized him from the pictures and was like, "Yes, you are finally coming for me.
After two and a half years, I bet he was ready.
He was.
Okay, so you bring him home, you assimilate, takes a while. What happens is Jackson starts to go to school and play sports and do all the things that, you know, normal kids do, or kids that are from here. What is the difference between Jackson's experience with those and your bio boys?
You know, they're all good athletes. Jackson is in sort of a different category of good athlete. You know, he jumped up on my husband's pull-up bar in kindergarten and repped out 15 pull-ups. So he's just, I mean, he's a very strong kid, very different build. So people stop us in Safeway and Albertsons and Whole Foods and say, "Oh, you're Jackson." They recognize him because they've seen their kids or grandkids play sports.
He's taught their CrossFit classes.
Totally. Totally. He loves yoga too. He's a total yoga ninja. But he's recognizable, right? So he's the one black kid everywhere we go. So people recognize him and they stop him and talk to him. And luckily he's an outgoing personality, so that doesn't bother him. But he does have issues sometimes as he's gotten older with kids who maybe don't appreciate the competition as much and have lashed out at him in ways that are really hurtful.
I mean, that's such an interesting thing. And when you told me the story about how it all manifests out of kind of jealousy about his athletic performance, that with young kids, the place that it goes is the easiest place. And that place is race, right? Where they're like, "You're different. We're going to call it out and try to cut you down."
That's exactly what it is. And oftentimes it's kids that are a little older. He had a really rough kind of 6-month period where there was a lot of it. And what's amazing to me is the way the parents react. It's varied all across the board.
So can you talk about his experience at summer camp?
Sure. So he was 7. The boys he was playing against were 10.
This was in a basketball camp, right?
In a basketball camp. He's lighting them up and they start ripping on his race. And what they said to him was, "It's really too bad that you were born with brown skin because it's so ugly." And so, you know, he was crying. He wouldn't tell the counselors what was wrong. He wouldn't tell our nanny when she picked him up what was wrong. He told me when I got home from work. And so I showed up really early to camp the next day and talked through with the 21-year-old counselors what had happened. And they were amazing. And it gave me a chance to talk to both of the moms of these 2 boys about what had happened. And it was really illuminating, I suppose. The difference in the 2 reactions with these 2 moms could not have been more stark.
Well, I kind of want to call out something too, because I think this is, to me, it's important because you are not your average mom. You are a CEO of a big company in Portland. You are from a family that's pretty well known here. You are a formidable human being. And I imagine once your mama bear gets triggered, that is like times 1,000, right? Because that's what matters most. And so to confront these two moms, like I imagine must have been hard for you a little bit, but easy given the circumstances. But having you come over and confront these two women, I would have really enjoyed seeing that.
Well, thank you. Part of the thing about being a thought leader at a local level and in the newspaper a lot, and, you know, most people just recognize me, is that you really have to approach it from a different place because people are already intimidated. And the goal isn't to intimidate or hurt people.
Right.
The goal is to let a little lesson sink in so they have the opportunity to talk to their kids. They're just kids.
Yeah.
And there's no judgment. My kids screw up all the time. This is the time when you want to intervene, because if they say something racist now, it's very different than if they say it when they're 13 or 14.
It's so true. So tell me about the two different reactions you had from each parent.
Well, one of the moms went into detective mode because her son denied it. And so she started asking questions. And even though he was lying about it, she ferreted it out really quickly. And she said to her son and to the counselors and to me, his dad will have his cell phone on him all day. I will have my cell phone on me all day. If anything like this happens again, I want you to call me, and he will not be returning to the camp. So she was right all over it, used it as a learning opportunity for her son, didn't humiliate him. Perfectly appropriate response. The other mom said she didn't believe it because they have a biracial couple at their church. So he's been exposed to people of different races. So she just didn't believe it. But that Jackson had kicked her son, and she wanted to know what the counselors were going to do about him kicking her son.
So she just turned it back.
She did, and she said, I don't believe it, and there were no witnesses. But your son kicked my son, so what are we going to do about that? And I said, well, there were no witnesses. So who knows if he did kick him? And the counselors, their kids, right, saw the difference between how the two parents reacted, and they asked one of the kids to leave the camp.
Wow.
And they let the other one stay.
Wow.
It just gives me so much hope for the younger generation that they recognized that one parent was going to deal with it and the other one wasn't. I mean, I couldn't have been more proud of these kids. I thought it was amazing of them and really emotionally intelligent reaction.
For sure. So coming off of that experience, how do you help Jackson handle that?
Jackson is going to have to deal with that his entire life. You have to think about what life is like for him now. He's adorable. He's 8. He's tiny. When Jackson is 15 and has a hood up because it's cold outside, that's a very different story. So in this house, we don't wear hoods. We don't wear hoods now because you've got to know that you scare people when you have a hood up because they can't see your whole face. And that could be dangerous to Jackson. It's not going to be dangerous to my older 2 kids.
Right.
But for Jackson, it's actually could be a life-threatening decision. So he has to know from a very young age how to talk to police officers, how to speak to adults.
And these are like real conversations you're having to have with your son.
We're not having the conversation about police officers yet, but we are having the conversation about differences and respecting differences in people. And Jackson sees skin color very differently than other kids his age that are not Black. He calls white people peach, and he cannot understand why we call white people white. He says, I only have one white friend, and she's real white. But it's...
Wait till he meets me.
You're not as white as my other friend, Jen. But you know, sees skin color very differently because he's had to confront it and deal with it very early on. And people ask him about it all the time and they don't understand why he's brown, other little kids. And when people ask him questions, it doesn't bother him. But when people make statements, he got called the N-word on the playground, not at his school. And he'd never heard that word before.
Yeah, he probably had no idea.
No idea.
Has no weight for him. Mm-mm. How did you find out? Did he come home and tell you?
He did. So the dad, he was at the park with a buddy and the dad went to the bathroom. He was gone for a minute and the kid had Jackson jumped on his back and punched him in the face. He didn't know what the word meant. He just knew that it was a fighting word. And then the kid flipped him over and called him an MFer, another word he had not heard before. But the kid knew that the dad was coming back. So he got on his bike and hauled ass away from there. But the kid was about 13.
Wow.
Way past an age where that's excusable.
Yeah.
But that really stung for Jackson.
Did you at that point have to explain to him what that meant? Or did you just kind of say, we don't even use that word?
I said, we don't use that word. And it's a negative connotation associated with it. And it's a slam on people of color. That's as far as I went with it. It'll become a more age-appropriate conversation over time.
Well, he'll probably also figure it out.
Yeah, fair enough. But, he's had incidences at school too. And the school they didn't really know how to handle it either because there's just so little diversity here. And
it's not something we have to deal with a ton. And I think this conversation is just like resonating with me. Like I feel it in my chest because our kids are the same age. And I feel so deeply ignorant for not talking to my son about this. So this is how deep my privilege runs. It didn't even occur to me, first off. And second off, I don't even know that Luke would understand it at this point. But again, that's ignorant because they totally do.
People do not give their kids enough credit for their intellectual abilities.
Yeah.
Second grade is about the time when kids start to notice differences. So do I think the kids that are making fun of Jackson's skin color are racist? No, I think they're 8. They're starting to notice differences. It would be like if Jackson had buck teeth or big ears.
Yep.
They would pick on anything just to tease each other.
Yep.
And so a lot of it's just lessons about kindness and how we treat people and their differences and accepting differences and embracing those differences.
But I feel like that little discernment that you made, though, is not like that's really nice and a really nice way to look at it, because I feel like my immediate go-to place would be a place of anger to the parents and to the kids. But I think your approach is actually much healthier than that and saying like, let's meet kids where they're at. Like it is about differences. And again, like I live in Seattle in a totally white neighborhood. And there is a second grade girl in his class who's Black. And I was waiting for Luke on the playground before school. And she came out one day and she looks at me, she goes, Miss Hull, did you know that I am African-American? And she was in first grade. And I just looked down and I said, you know what? Will you just tell me all about what that means? Because I had no idea how to react to it. And so she said, well, it means that my ancestors are from Africa. It means that my hair is different. And it means that I am a Black warrior princess. And I was like, yeah, it does. That is amazing. But it was like this, she had just watched Black Panther. And like for the first time had seen people like in that context who look like her. And that's what she was talking about is her, Black warrior. But it was so awesome. And I just thought, oh my God, like she is way more woke than I am at 8 because she's just noticing.
She sounds like a really cool chick. And I bet she has some really cool parents too.
She has a real cool mom. And I actually asked her mom to give some parenting seminars because clearly she is doing something very right. But similarly to you, It's like these conversations of meeting kids where they're at and giving kids the benefit of the doubt and saying this is a teachable lesson about kindness and difference.
You have to give people a chance to talk to their kids about those things. I think it's doing a disservice to kids if you're not having those conversations. And it's funny because you mentioned Black Panther. Black Panther is a really big deal in Jackson's life too.
Yeah.
It's a very empowering movie
sure
for, children of color.
Yeah. So Vanessa, what should we be telling our kids? How should we be having these conversations? I feel like there needs to be a guidebook for parents who don't have to deal with this all the time. Like, where do you even start?
You start by not shying away from the conversation and not shying away from the words. So it's one of those things you learn about in adoption counseling right from the beginning. And it's one of those things that I wish in the adoption world people would be required to do, because a lot of these organizations are faith-based. There's a lot of prayer about it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's not as much emphasis on education about it and preparedness. You can't really pray those things away.
No.
Right? And that's really the approach that most people take. In fact, I shut myself out of all the adoption boards because there's, this whole undercurrent about spanking and that's the right way to discipline these kids who are, it's part of the culture of, the hardcore Bible focused set. So it's definitely part of every thread on adopting from Africa, the discipline portion. But it's just, if you take the time to talk to your kids, use the real words, say Black, not African American. Jackson's not African American. He's African.
Yeah. But I feel like even sitting here saying the word Black, I feel uncomfortable. Because I feel like I don't know. Black is the right word.
Black is the right word. We should not shy away from the word Black. If African American isn't correct, then we shouldn't use African American. We should say Black and Asian and Chinese and Japanese and Korean and Indian, and don't be afraid to use those words. Not the slur words, obviously.
Right.
But, use the real words. Just like if you're having a sex ed talk with your kids, you don't use euphemisms for body parts. It's very similar. We're just direct.
Or if you're like my mom, you just throw a book at me and say, read this.
Oh, nice. Good one, Mom.
I know. Thanks, Mom. So I think having the conversation is so important. And actually, after you and I talked months ago, that day sat my son down and was like, we have never talked about this, but we should. And actually had a great conversation. He looked at me like I had 4 heads and was like, duh, Mom. Like, I've noticed that she's Black. It doesn't matter. Like, what's the big deal? And I'm like, okay, you're 8, but like, let's talk about the insults about it are the same as calling somebody with buck teeth a name or calling somebody that's overweight a name. Like it falls into that same category. And that seemed to be something he could wrap his brain around more. And just having the conversation that you can't call people names.
You can't call people names.
Period.
And listen, this is the way that people were born. It's not okay to make people feel bad about the way they were born. So it's really just an education piece, and you have to keep talking about it too.
Yeah. So much of this is educational, and so much of it is exactly what you're saying, is like having the conversation about it, because my tendency is to shy away from that conversation because it's uncomfortable. I don't want to make anyone mad. I don't necessarily have confidence in my own ability to know what the right vernacular is. But I think this particular situation has really made me aware that my own lack of confidence in it is not a good enough reason to not have the conversation with my kids.
Totally. It is uncomfortable.
Yeah,
it feels uncomfortable for sure. That said, if you make a point to introduce them to people as, this is Dr. So-and-so.
Yep.
I always make that point, especially when it's a woman or a person of color, that my kids understand that that person is a doctor. They've achieved something really incredible. So they see that there are different people in those positions of authority, that it's not just a white man.
Yeah, it's so important. Well, I so appreciate you being willing to have this conversation, and not only to have it with me, because I feel like I've learned a ton, but also to be able to share it with anybody out there that might be shying away from this conversation, because I can't imagine that I'm the only one. And I can't imagine you're the only adoptive mom that is horrified by what she's seeing and hearing in these communities that Seattle and Portland really preach a lot about how inclusive they are and how liberal they are. But the actual experience of someone of color in this city is very different.
It is very different. They're not facing it
Right.
very often, and they don't know what to do with it. So props to Jackson's school. He's the only Black kid in the school. There are a couple of mixed race kids. But for bringing in a consultant to teach them how to deal with it in a way that's helping these kids and parents
Yep.
evolve their families.
I think that's exactly the word. It is totally an evolution. And I mean, this podcast has given me a really good reason to get super far out of my comfort zone and learn a lot more. But for those of you listening, this is really important. It's important evolution for us as we're parenting our kids into this new generation who's really so cool. Like, these kids are cool. They're so much more woke than we are, but it is up to us to kind of lead them down that path. And I think, you know, you're doing an awesome job of that. So I really appreciate you being willing to share yourself and your story with everybody who's listening.
Thank you for offering me the platform to do it. I really appreciate it.
As I've said before, my commitment and my mission remains to continue having non-judgmental and potentially very uncomfortable conversations. Vanessa made herself open and vulnerable in educating the people around her about her family's experience, and I am so, so grateful. My hope, as always, is that you can take something away and have an open conversation with your own children. If you have comments, please leave them on my website at www.rightinfrontofmyface.net. You can find me on email at infrontofmyface@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at infrontofmyface. You can find me on Instagram at rightinfrontofmyface. Thank you so much to everybody for spending your time listening to these stories. If you like them, please leave a review. Please subscribe. Please tell your friends about it. This podcast relies on your support to continue growing. Thanks so much.